Margaret Winters clutched the worn wooden post of the auction platform, her knuckles white with terror as her husband's voice rang out across the dusty square of Redemption Creek, Colorado. 5 acres of prime farmland for the woman. Do I hear an offer? The year was 1875, and to Marshall Winters, his wife of 3 years had become nothing more than a bargaining chip in his desperate quest for wealth and land. "This ain't right, Marshall," someone called from the crowd gathering in the late afternoon sun. "You can't sell your own wife." "Watch me," Marshall sneered, his once handsome face twisted with greed and liquor. "She's my property same as my horse and cattle, and she ain't worth half as much as either." Margaret fought back tears, the shame burning hotter than the July sun beating down on her bonnet. How had it come to this? The man she'd married back east had promised her a life of adventure and prosperity in the West. Instead, she'd endured 3 years of his gambling, drinking, and increasingly violent outbursts. Now, with debts mounting and creditors closing in, he decided his final play would be to auction her off to the highest bidder. From the edge of the crowd, Mason Cole watched, his weathered face darkening with each passing moment. At 32, he'd seen his share of frontier injustice, but this a man selling his own wife crossed a line he couldn't ignore. His hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip, but violence wouldn't solve this. Not here, not with the sheriff conveniently absent and half the men in town, either afraid of Marshall Winters or curious enough to see how this unholy auction would play out. 20 acres in the South Valley, Marshall continued, yanking Margaret forward like a reluctant mare. Good, fertile land for a good, fertile woman. She can cook, clean, and warm your bed. What more could a lonely frontiersman want? The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some men looking away in disgust while others assessed Margaret with calculating eyes. At 26, she was still young and beautiful despite the hardship etched into her face. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight beneath her bonnet, and though tear-stained, her eyes flashed with a defiance that told Mason she hadn't surrendered her spirit, even if her body was being offered to the highest bidder. "I'll take her for the 20 acres, a voice called out, and Margaret's stomach turned as she recognized Bartholomew Jenkins, the owner of the saloon and a man known for his cruelty to the women who worked for him. "Been needing someone to keep the place tidy. 20 acres from Mr. Jenkins." Marshall announced triumphantly. "Do I hear more?" Mason had seen enough. He stepped forward, the crowd parting as his spurs clinked against the hard, packed dirt. "This stops now, Winters," he called out, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who rarely needed to raise it to be heard. Marshall's hand moved to his pistol. "This ain't your business, Cole. Step back or I'll give you 50 acres, Mason interrupted, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face, where shock and the first flicker of hope were battling for dominance. "My best grazing land north of town. And 200 in gold." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mason Cole was one of the most successful ranchers in the territory, his broken spur spread respected and coveted. 50 acres of his land was worth 10 times what Jenkins had offered. Marshall's eyes narrowed with greedy calculation. 50 acres and 200 in gold, he repeated, clearly tempted but suspicious of Mason's motives. "Why would you pay so much for a woman you don't even know?" Mason climbed the steps to the platform, his tall frame casting a shadow over Marshall. "Because unlike you, I still remember what it means to be a man," he turned to the crowd. "And because this isn't an auction, it's a crime. This woman isn't property to be sold. She's a human being with rights under the law. The law." Marshall laughed, though there was an edge of nervousness to it now. "The law says a husband has rights over his wife. The law's on my side." "Is it?" Mason countered, addressing the crowd now. "Judge Parker arrives on tomorrow's stage for circuit court." I wonder what he'd make of a man selling his wife like cattle. Last I heard, that kind of trade was frowned upon even in these parts. Uncertainty flickered across Marshall's face. Judge Isaac Parker, known throughout the territories as the hanging judge, had a reputation for harsh justice and little patience for those who twisted the law to their own ends. "Take the 50 acres, Winters," Mason said, his voice low and dangerous. "Take it and leave town before the judge arrives." Otherwise, I'll make sure he hears about your unique interpretation of marriage vows." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret hardly dared to breathe, her eyes fixed on Mason Cole's face, a face she'd seen around town but never really noticed before. Now, it seemed like the face of salvation itself. Marshall's gaze darted between Mason, the crowd, and his wife. Finally, greed won out over pride. 50 acres and 200 in gold, he agreed, but I want the papers signed tonight and the gold in my hand. You'll have them, Mason assured him. And then you'll be on the evening stage out of town. You don't come back, you don't contact her, you don't make any claim on her ever again. Fine by me, Marshall said with a dismissive wave. She was more trouble than she was worth anyway. Mason turned to Margaret, his eyes softening as he took in her trembling form. "Mrs. Winters," he said, removing his hat, "I apologize for discussing you as if you weren't present. This ain't right, none of it, but if you'll allow me, I'd like to help you out of this situation." Margaret looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. His face was tanned from years under the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. His eyes were a clear blue, honest and direct. She'd heard talk about Mason Cole around town that he was fair to his workers, generous when times were hard and formidable when crossed. But she'd never heard a whisper about cruelty or dishonesty. "Why?" she whispered, too low for the crowd to hear. "Why would you do this for me?" Mason's reply was equally soft. "Because no one else was going to, and because no one deserves to be treated like this." Margaret swallowed hard, weighing her options. She had none, really. Either accept this stranger's help or be sold to Bartholomew Jenkins and face a fate she couldn't bear to contemplate. "Thank you, Mr. Cole," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I accept your assistance." Mason nodded, then turned back to Marshall. "We'll meet at the land office in an hour. Have your things packed and be ready to leave on the evening stage." It wasn't a request. Marshall glared but nodded, clearly calculating that 50 acres of prime land was worth more than whatever satisfaction he might get from defying Mason Cole. He stormed off the platform without a backward glance at the wife he'd just sold. The crowd began to disperse, some looking relieved, others disappointed that the spectacle had ended so abruptly. Mason offered his arm to Margaret. "If you'd allow me, madam, I'd like to escort you someplace quiet where we can discuss what happens next." Margaret hesitated only a moment before placing her hand on his arm. Whatever happened next couldn't possibly be worse than what she'd just escaped. "Lead the way, Mr. Cole." They walked in silence through town, past the curious stares and whispered comments. Mason led her to the hotel, a respectable establishment where he was clearly known and respected. The clerk nodded deferentially as Mason requested a private dining room. "I thought you might be more comfortable talking here than at the saloon," Mason explained as they were shown to a small room with a table and chairs. "And you look like you could use a meal." Margaret realized she hadn't eaten since breakfast, her stomach too knotted with fear after Marshall had announced his plans for the day. "That's very thoughtful, thank you." After ordering food, Mason sat across from her, his hat on the table between them. "Mrs. Winters, please," she interrupted. "I'd rather not use that name anymore if it's all the same to you." "My maiden name was Hayes, Margaret Hayes." Mason nodded. "Miss Hayes, then, I want to be clear about something. That land and money I offered, it's yours. I'm not buying you. I'm buying your freedom from a man who had no right to sell you in the first place." Margaret stared at him, disbelief warring with hope. "Mine, but the land will be deeded to you, not me. The money goes to him to get him out of your life for good. Once that's done, what you do next is entirely your choice." "But why?" Margaret asked, bewildered by his generosity. "You don't know me, you owe me nothing." Mason looked uncomfortable for the first time. "Let's just say I've seen what happens to women with no choices in this territory. It doesn't end well. I couldn't stand by and watch that happen to you." Their food arrived, roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread, momentarily pausing their conversation. Margaret realized how hungry she was and began to eat, self-conscious under Mason's watchful gaze. "You have options," he continued after a while. "That land is valuable. You could sell it, use the money to go back east if you have family there, or you could work it, though that's a hard life for anyone, let alone a woman alone." Margaret set down her fork. I have no family left back east. My parents died 2 years ago. It's why Marshall and I came west. There was nothing keeping us there anymore. She took a deep breath. As for working the land, I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Cole, but you're right that it would be difficult alone. There's another option, Mason said carefully. I'm always looking for good help at Broken Spur. My housekeeper, Mrs. Bentley, could use assistance with the main house. It would give you a safe place to stay while you decide what you want to do long term. Margaret studied him, trying to discern his motives. And what would you expect in return, Mr. Cole? His eyes widened slightly, then understanding dawned. Nothing improper, Miss Hayes. I'm offering employment, not anything else. You'd have your own quarters, fair wages, and the respect due any lady. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Margaret felt a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to ease. I apologize for the implication, Mr. Cole. Recent events have made me cautious. No apology needed, he assured her. It's a reasonable question given the circumstances. A clock on the wall chimed the hour and Mason rose. I need to meet Winters at the land office now. You're welcome to come or you can stay here and rest. The hotel has a room ready for you tonight either way. Margaret stood as well. I'll come, I want to see this finished. Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. Of course. The transaction at the land office was swift and businesslike. Marshall barely looked at Margaret as he signed the papers transferring the deed to 50 acres of the Broken Spur to her name, then pocketed the pouch of gold coins Mason provided. The land agent, a balding man named Perkins, kept darting nervous glances between the three of them, clearly aware that something unusual was happening but professional enough not to comment. Stage leaves in 20 minutes, Mason reminded Marshall as they finished. I've taken the liberty of securing you a ticket, Marshall sneered. Always the gentleman, ain't you, Cole? Don't worry, I'll be on that stage. Plenty of opportunity elsewhere for a man with means. He patted the pouch of gold, then finally turned to Margaret. Good riddance to you. Hope you enjoy being Cole's new plaything. Mason stepped forward, his face darkening, but Margaret placed a restraining hand on his arm. He's not worth it, she said quietly, and he's wrong about you. Marshall laughed, the sound bitter and hollow, then walked out without another word. They watched through the window as he crossed the street to the stagecoach office, the sun beginning to set behind the mountains. It's done, Mason said, turning back to Margaret. You're free of him. For the first time that day, Margaret allowed herself to really believe it. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, determined not to break down in the land office. Thank you, Mr. Cole. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness. Live well, he said simply. That's repayment enough. They watched from a distance as the evening stage departed, Marshall Winters aboard and bound for Denver, if the stage schedule was to be believed. Only when the cloud of dust had settled on the horizon did Margaret feel the last of her fear subside, replaced by the overwhelming uncertainty of what came next. I'd like to accept your offer, she said as they walked back toward the hotel. Of employment at Broken Spur, I mean. At least until I decide what to do with the land. Mason nodded, pleased but trying not to show it too openly. Mrs. Bentley will be glad for the help. We can ride out tomorrow morning if that suits you. It does, Margaret agreed, feeling for the first time in years that she was making a choice rather than having one forced upon her. I don't have much to pack. Marshall never allowed me many possessions. We can remedy that, Mason assured her. Redemption Creek doesn't have much, but there's a dry goods store where we can get you whatever you need before we leave. They reached the hotel and Mason tipped his hat to her. I'll leave you to rest, Miss Hayes. It's been a trying day for you. Breakfast is at 7 if that's not too early. Not at all, Mr. Cole. I'll be ready. As Margaret climbed the stairs to her room, a real hotel room, not the shabby rented room above the livery where she and Marshall had been staying, she felt both exhausted and strangely exhilarated. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in 3 years, it held possibility rather than dread. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect summer day that made the hardships of frontier life seem worthwhile. Margaret rose early, having slept better than she had in months, and dressed in her one good dress, a faded blue cotton that had once been quite fashionable back east. Mason was waiting in the hotel dining room, nursing a cup of coffee and reading a newspaper. He stood when he saw her, and Margaret was struck again by his imposing height and the quiet dignity he carried. "Good morning, Miss Hayes," he greeted her, pulling out a chair. "I trust you slept well, better than I have in a very long time," she admitted, accepting the seat. "Thank you again for everything." After a hearty breakfast, they visited the dry goods store, where Mason insisted on advancing her first month's wages so she could purchase necessities, clothing, toiletries, and a sturdy valise to carry it all. Margaret protested at first, but Mason was gently insistent. "Consider it an investment in a valued employee," he said with a hint of a smile. "Besides, Mrs. Bentley would have my hide if I brought you to Broken Spur without proper attire." By mid-morning they were on the road out of town, Margaret seated beside Mason in his wagon. Her new possessions, along with the deed to her 50 acres, were safely stowed in the back. As Redemption Creek receded behind them, Margaret felt a weight lifting from her shoulders with each passing mile. "It's beautiful country," she remarked, taking in the sweeping vistas of mountains, forests, and valleys that surrounded them. "I never really noticed before." "Marshall kept me too busy with chores to appreciate it." "It grows on you," Mason agreed, his hands steady on the reins. "I came out here 15 years ago with nothing but the clothes on my back and a dream of something better. Never planned to stay, but after a while couldn't imagine being anywhere else." "How did you build Broken Spur?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious about the man who had so unexpectedly changed her life. Mason's expression grew distant, remembering. "Started as a ranch hand, saved every penny. Got lucky in a poker game, won my first 100 acres from a man too drunk to know better. Built from there, acre by acre, cow by cow. It wasn't easy, but nothing worth having ever is. And now it's one of the most successful ranches in the territory, from what I hear." He shrugged modestly. "We do all right. Good land, good cattle, good people working it. That's the secret if there is one, surrounding yourself with good people." The journey to Broken Spur took most of the day, giving Margaret time to learn more about Mason and the ranch that would be her new home. He spoke with pride of his herd of cattle, the improvements he'd made to the land, and especially of the people who worked for him: Mrs. Bentley, the housekeeper who'd been with him for a decade, Jake, his foreman, and the dozen or so cowboys who handled the cattle. "They're like family to me," Mason explained. "Most of them have been with me for years. We look out for each other." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they crested a hill and Mason reined in the horses. "There it is," he said, gesturing to the valley below. "Broken Spur." Margaret gasped softly at the sight. The ranch spread out before them, a collection of well-maintained buildings centered around a large 2-story house. Corrals, barns, and bunkhouses were arranged in a practical but pleasing manner, and beyond them stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed. A creek wound through the property, lined with cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. It was, Margaret thought, exactly what a prosperous western ranch should look like. "It's magnificent," she said honestly. "You've built something remarkable here, Mr. Cole." A smile touched his lips, pleasure at her approval evident in his eyes. "Thank you, it's home." As they drove down into the valley, Margaret felt a curious mixture of anticipation and trepidation. What place would she find for herself here? Would she be accepted, or viewed with suspicion as an outsider with an unusual story? And what of Mason Cole himself, this enigmatic man whose kindness had saved her from a terrible fate? These questions and more swirled in her mind as they approached the ranch house, where a stout, gray-haired woman in an apron was already emerging onto the porch, alerted by the sound of the wagon. "Mrs. Bentley," Mason called out as he brought the wagon to a halt. "I've brought you some help." The housekeeper approached, her shrewd eyes taking in Margaret's appearance with keen interest. "So I see," she said, her voice warm despite her assessing gaze. "About time, too. This place needs a woman's touch beyond what these old hands can provide." Mason helped Margaret down from the wagon, then made the introductions. "Mrs. Edith Bentley, this is Miss Margaret Hayes. She'll be assisting you with the house." Mrs. Bentley's firm handshake was surprisingly strong for a woman of her years. "Welcome to Broken Spur, Miss Hayes." Don't you worry about a thing, we'll have you settled in no time. True to her word, Mrs. Bentley efficiently showed Margaret to her room, a pleasant chamber on the second floor with a comfortable bed, a chest of drawers, a small writing desk, and a window that looked out over the ranch yard and the mountains beyond. It was simply furnished but clean and well-maintained, more comfortable than anywhere Margaret had lived since leaving her parents' home back east. Bathrooms down the hall, Mrs. Bentley explained. We're modern here, got indoor plumbing and hot water from the kitchen boiler. Mr. Cole believes in comfort, says there's enough hardship in ranch life without making it worse than it needs to be. It's lovely, Margaret said sincerely, setting her new valise on the bed. More than I expected, Mrs. Bentley's expression softened. Mr. Cole told me a bit about your situation. Not details. Mind you, he's too much of a gentleman for that, but enough to know you've had a rough go of it. Well, you're safe here. Nobody at Broken Spur would ever mistreat a woman. The kindness in the older woman's voice nearly undid Margaret's composure. Thank you, she managed, blinking back tears. None of that now, Mrs. Bentley said briskly, though her eyes were kind. Get yourself settled, then come down for supper. The men eat in the bunkhouse, but Mr. Cole takes his meals in the dining room and you'll join us there. 7 o'clock sharp, he doesn't tolerate tardiness at mealtimes. Left alone, Margaret unpacked her few possessions, placing her new clothes in the drawers and arranging her toiletries on the washstand. Last of all, she carefully tucked the deed to her 50 acres in the drawer of the writing desk. It still seemed unreal that she owned land, that she was free of Marshall, that she was here in this beautiful place with the possibility of a new beginning. Supper that evening was a simple but delicious affair: roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. Mason, seated at the head of the table, was more relaxed here in his own home, sharing stories of the day's ranch activities and asking Margaret about herself with genuine interest. Mrs. Bentley tells me you've been making her feel quite welcome, he said with a smile for the housekeeper who was serving the pie. I'm glad to hear it. Miss Hayes will be a wonderful addition to our household, Mrs. Bentley declared. She has a good eye for detail, which is more than I can say for most. Margaret flushed at the praise. I haven't done anything yet to earn such kind words. Nonsense, the housekeeper replied. I can tell about people, been doing it for 63 years and rarely wrong. After dinner, Mason excused himself to check on a mare that was close to foaling, leaving Margaret and Mrs. Bentley to become better acquainted over coffee in the kitchen. He's a good man, Mrs. Bentley said without preamble once they were alone. The best I've known, and I don't say that lightly. Margaret nodded, understanding that the housekeeper was telling her something important. I believe it, what he did for me. I still can't quite comprehend it. That's just his way, Mrs. Bentley said, pouring more coffee. Sees something wrong and fixes it, doesn't make a fuss about it. Been that way since I've known him. How did you come to work for him? Margaret asked, curious about the relationship between the ranch owner and his housekeeper, which seemed to go beyond mere employment. Mrs. Bentley's weathered face softened with memory. My husband and I had a small place north of here. When he died, I couldn't manage it alone. Bank was fixing to foreclose when Mason stepped in, paid off the note, and offered me a position here. Said he needed a housekeeper, but truth was, he just couldn't stand to see a widow lose everything. That sounds like him from what little I know, Margaret said, warming her hands on her coffee cup. He's been alone too long, Mrs. Bentley continued, her eyes sharp on Margaret's face. Built this ranch, made it successful, but a man needs more than work to make a life complete. Margaret felt a blush rising to her cheeks, understanding the implication. Mrs. Bentley, I'm here as an employee, nothing more. Mr. Cole made that very clear. Of course he did, the older woman said with a knowing smile. He's a gentleman. But I've seen the way he looks at you, even in just these few hours. There's something there, whether either of you is ready to admit it or not. Before Margaret could formulate a response, the kitchen door opened, and Mason returned, bringing with him the cool evening air and a pleased expression. Mare's doing well, he announced. Jake thinks she'll deliver before midnight, a fine colt if his guess is right. He usually is about these things, Mrs. Bentley said, rising to pour him coffee. Miss Hayes and I were just getting acquainted. Good, Mason said, accepting the cup with a nod of thanks. I hope she's been telling you all the ranch gossip. Mrs. Bentley knows everything about everyone for 50 miles around. Only the important things, the housekeeper sniffed, though there was affection in her tone. Someone has to keep track of what matters. They talked a while longer, the conversation easy and comfortable, until Mrs. Bentley declared it was time for her to retire. These old bones need their rest, she said, gathering the coffee cups. And Miss Hayes must be exhausted after everything she's been through. Left alone with Mason, Margaret felt a momentary awkwardness, aware of Mrs. Bentley's earlier observations. It's been a remarkable day, she said, filling the silence. I'm still trying to believe it's real. Mason leaned back in his chair, regarding her thoughtfully. It's real enough. Tomorrow will likely feel more so once you settle into the routine here. What will my duties be exactly? Margaret asked. Mrs. Bentley mentioned helping with the house, but I'd like to know what you expect of me. Mrs. Bentley runs the household, Mason explained. She'll direct your work cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever needs doing. It's a big house for one person to manage alone, especially with all the cowboys tracking in dirt and needing feeding. A smile tugged at his lips. They're good men, but not exactly tidy. Margaret nodded, relieved at the straightforward answer. I can handle that. I'm a good cook, though perhaps not up to Mrs. Bentley's standards yet. She'll teach you her secrets, Mason assured her. She's been threatening to retire for years now, says her joints can't take the stairs much longer. Having you here will ease her burden considerably. I'm glad to be useful, Margaret said honestly. After everything, it feels good to have a purpose again. Mason studied her face, his expression thoughtful. You know, Miss Hayes, most women who have been through what you have might be bitter, angry at the world, but you seem determined to move forward. That takes courage. Margaret looked down at her hands, surprised and touched by his insight. I've been angry, she admitted. At Marshall, at myself for not seeing him clearly sooner, at a world that allows men to treat women as property, but anger alone doesn't change anything. It certainly doesn't build a better life. Wise words, Mason said softly, and truer than you know. Their eyes met across the table, and Margaret felt something shift between them, a connection, tentative but real, based on mutual respect, and perhaps the first stirrings of something more. But it was too soon, too fragile to acknowledge openly. Mason seemed to sense this too, for he rose from his chair with a slight clearing of his throat. It's getting late, and tomorrow will be a full day. I should let you get some rest. Yes, Margaret agreed, standing as well. Thank you for everything, Mr. Cole, for my room, for the job, for saving me. Mason, he said abruptly. Please call me Mason. Mr. Cole makes me feel like my father. A smile touched her lips. Mason, then, and I'm Margaret. Margaret, he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. Sleep well, I'll see you at breakfast. As Margaret prepared for bed that night in her new room, she found herself thinking of Mason Cole's blue eyes and the way they crinkled at the corners when he smiled. It was far too soon to be having such thoughts, she knew. Her heart was still bruised from Marshall's cruelty, her future uncertain. And yet, as she drifted off to sleep, it was Mason's face that followed her into dreams, not the nightmare of the auction block she had feared would haunt her. The next weeks at Broken Spur fell into a pleasant rhythm for Margaret. Each day brought new tasks and challenges as she learned the workings of the ranch household from Mrs. Bentley. The older woman proved to be a patient teacher, showing Margaret everything from how to manage the ranch's extensive pantry to the proper way to iron Mason's shirts. He likes them just so, Mrs. Bentley explained, demonstrating the precise crease in the collar. Not too stiff, mind you, but crisp enough to look proper. Margaret found herself paying particular attention to these lessons, wanting Mason's shirts to be perfect, though she tried not to examine her motivations too closely. The ranch hands, initially curious about the new addition to the household, quickly accepted Margaret's presence. Jake, the foreman, a weathered man in his 50s with a perpetually sunburned nose, was particularly welcoming. Boss hasn't looked this cheerful in years, he confided to Margaret one morning when she brought coffee to the men working in the corral. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. Margaret blushed, protesting that she wasn't doing anything, but Jake just winked and returned to his work. She saw Mason daily, usually at meals and occasionally around the ranch as she went about her duties. He was often busy with the countless tasks required to run a successful cattle operation, but he always made time to ask about her day and whether she was settling in comfortably. Sometimes in the evenings, if work allowed, they would sit on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. These quiet moments became precious to Margaret, a time when they could talk freely about books they'd read, places they'd seen, and gradually more personal matters. "Did you always want to be a rancher?" she asked one such evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival at Broken Spur. Mason considered the question, rocking gently in his chair. "No, can't say that I did. My father was a lawyer back in St. Louis, expected me to follow in his footsteps. I even studied law for a year before I realized I'd suffocate if I spent my life indoors surrounded by books and papers." "So you came west?" Much to my father's dismay, Mason confirmed with a rueful smile. "We didn't speak for almost 5 years after I left. He was convinced I'd get myself killed by Indians or outlaws within the first month." "But you didn't," Margaret said, smiling. "Came close a few times," he admitted, "but I learned quick and I was lucky, found good people to teach me what I needed to know. And your father, did you ever reconcile?" A shadow crossed Mason's face. "Eventually, he came out to visit when I'd been here about 6 years. By then, I had the beginnings of Broken Spur established. Think he was surprised to find me alive and actually making something of myself. We made our peace before he died the following year." "I'm glad you had that chance," Margaret said softly, thinking of her own parents, gone before she could make them understand why she'd chosen to marry Marshall and follow him west. Mason seemed to read her thoughts. "You mentioned your parents passed before you came west. Were you close to them?" "Very," Margaret said, the familiar ache of loss rising in her chest. "My father was a professor of literature at a small college. My mother taught piano. They were wonderful, loving people who valued education and kindness above all else." "They would be proud of the woman you've become," Mason said with such conviction that Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Would they? I'm not so sure. I made such a terrible mistake with Marshall. They tried to warn me, but I was too blinded by his charm to listen." Mason reached across the space between their chairs, briefly covering her hand with his. "We all make mistakes, Margaret. It's how we recover from them that matters." The warmth of his touch lingered long after he withdrew his hand, and Margaret found herself thinking of it as she lay in bed that night, wondering at the increasing frequency with which Mason Cole occupied her thoughts. The arrival of autumn brought with it the cattle roundup, a busy time at Broken Spur when the herd was gathered, calves were branded, and decisions were made about which animals to keep and which to sell. The house was filled with activity as Margaret and Mrs. Bentley prepared enormous meals to feed the hungry cowboys who worked from dawn to dusk. "Never seen men eat so much," Margaret marveled one evening as she kneaded enough bread dough for 20 loaves. "It's like feeding an army. Ranch work builds appetites, Mrs. Bentley agreed, stirring a massive pot of beef stew. "And they deserve every bite. It's backbreaking work, especially during roundup." Margaret had glimpsed enough of the cowboys' activities to know this was true. She'd watched from the porch as Mason rode out each morning with his men, returning at dusk covered in dust and sometimes blood from the day's work. Despite his obvious exhaustion, he never failed to thank her and Mrs. Bentley for the meals they prepared, his appreciation genuine and warming. One evening during the second week of roundup, Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard a commotion from the direction of the corrals. Shouts and the pounding of hooves sent her hurrying around the house, still clutching a damp shirt in her hands. The scene that met her eyes sent her heart into her throat. A group of cowboys was gathered around a figure on the ground, and even from a distance, she recognized Mason's distinctive hat lying in the dirt beside him. Without conscious thought, Margaret dropped the shirt and ran toward the corral, fear propelling her faster than she'd ever moved. "What happened?" she demanded as she reached the group, pushing through to where Mason lay. "Boss got thrown," Jake explained grimly. "Damned Mustang we were breaking decided to put up a fight, caught him off guard." Mason was conscious but clearly in pain, his face pale beneath his tan. A gash on his forehead was bleeding freely, and he was holding his left arm at an awkward angle. When he saw Margaret, he attempted a smile that turned into a grimace. "Not as young as I used to be," he managed, his voice strained. "Should have let one of the boys handle that horse." "We need to get him to the house," Margaret said, taking charge despite her racing heart. "Jake, can you help him walk?" Between Jake and another cowboy, they managed to get Mason to his feet and support him back to the house, where Mrs. Bentley was already clearing the kitchen table, her experienced eye having taken in the situation from the window. "Lay him down here," she directed, spreading a clean sheet over the table. "Miss Hayes, fetch my medicine box from the pantry, and water will need hot water." The next hour passed in a blur of activity as they tended to Mason's injuries. The cut on his forehead required stitches, which Mrs. Bentley performed with surprising skill while Margaret held Mason's hand. His arm, though not broken, had been wrenched badly at the shoulder and needed to be bound. "You're lucky it wasn't worse," Mrs. Bentley scolded as she finished bandaging him. "What were you thinking, taking on that wild devil of a horse yourself?" "Wasn't thinking," Mason admitted, wincing as he tried to sit up. "That's the problem." "Stay still," Margaret ordered, her initial fear having given way to a combination of relief and exasperation. "You could have been killed." Mason's eyes found hers, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Were you worried about me, Margaret?" "Of course I was worried," she said, flustered by the intensity of his gaze. "We all were, Mrs. Bentley, who had been gathering her medical supplies, made a sound that might have been a snort. "I'll just take these things back where they belong," she said, picking up her box. "Miss Hayes can help you to your room, Mr. Cole. You need rest." Before Margaret could protest this arrangement, the housekeeper had disappeared into the pantry, leaving her alone with Mason in the kitchen. "Can you stand?" she asked, offering her arm for support. Mason nodded, grimacing as he eased himself off the table. "Just a bit dizzy, nothing serious." But as he tried to take a step, he swayed alarmingly, and Margaret quickly slipped her arm around his waist. "Lean on me," she instructed. "Slowly now." The journey up the stairs to Mason's bedroom was a careful, halting process that brought them into closer physical proximity than ever before. Margaret was acutely aware of the solid warmth of his body against hers, the scent of him leather and sweat, and something uniquely Mason filling her senses. His bedroom, when they finally reached it, was simply but comfortably furnished, dominated by a large four-poster bed. Margaret hesitated at the threshold, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of helping him to his bed, but Mason's increasing pallor convinced her that propriety was less important than his well-being. "Just to the edge of the bed," she said, guiding him across the room. "Can you sit?" Mason sank onto the mattress with a grateful sigh. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with pain and something else Margaret couldn't quite identify. "I'm sorry to be such a burden." "You're not a burden," she assured him, stepping back once she was certain he wouldn't fall. "But you are a stubborn man who takes unnecessary risks." A smile tugged at his lips despite his obvious discomfort. "Not the first time I've been called stubborn." "I imagine not," Margaret replied, finding herself smiling back. "Would you like me to help you with your boots?" At his nod, she knelt and began to work his boots off, trying to be gentle despite the awkwardness of the task. As she set the second boot aside, she looked up to find Mason watching her with an expression that made her heart skip a beat. "Margaret," he said softly, "I've been wanting to talk to you about something." She straightened, suddenly nervous. "Yes, that land, your 50 acres, I've been thinking about it. It's good land, but as we discussed, difficult for one person to work alone." "I've been thinking about it too," Margaret admitted, perching cautiously on the edge of the bed beside him. "I'm grateful for it, truly, but I'm not sure what to do with it." Mason took a deep breath, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. "I have a proposition for you." "A business proposition," he clarified quickly. "I'd like to buy that land from you for a fair price, more than fair actually, and incorporate it into Broken Spur." Margaret blinked in surprise. This was not at all what she had expected him to say. "You want to buy my land?" "Yes," Mason confirmed. "It adjoins my north pasture and would be a natural extension of the ranch. I'd pay you double what it's worth on the open market." "But why?" Margaret asked, confused. You already gave it to me. Why would you want to buy it back? Mason looked uncomfortable, though whether from his injuries or the conversation was hard to tell. Because I want you to have options, Margaret. Real options, not just the ones that circumstance has forced upon you. With that money, you could do anything you wanted, start a business in town, travel, build a life entirely of your own choosing. Margaret studied his face, trying to understand. And if I sold you the land, would you expect me to leave Broken Spur? No. The vehemence of his response startled them both. No, he repeated more calmly. You have a place here as long as you want it. This isn't about that at all. Then what is it about, Mason? Margaret pressed, sensing there was something he wasn't saying. He sighed, running his good hand through his hair. It's about giving you the freedom to choose your own path without feeling obligated to me or anyone else. When I intervened that day in town, I didn't want to just transfer you from one man's control to another's. Understanding dawned, and with it a warmth that spread through Margaret's chest. You think I stay here out of gratitude or obligation, don't you? At least in part. Mason's blue eyes searched hers. I gave you a way out of a terrible situation. It would be natural to feel indebted. Margaret shook her head, a smile forming despite the seriousness of the conversation. For a smart man, Mason Cole, you can be remarkably obtuse sometimes. His brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? I mean, Margaret said, gathering her courage, that I stay at Broken Spur because I want to be here. Because in these past months, it's become more of a home to me than anywhere I've lived since my parents died. Because Mrs. Bentley and Jake and all the others have become like family. She paused, then added softly, and because you're here. The last words hung in the air between them, freighted with meaning. Mason's expression changed, hope replacing confusion. Margaret, he began, but she wasn't finished. I don't want to sell my land, she said firmly. Not because I plan to work it myself, but because it represents something important to me, the first thing that was truly mine, that no one could take away. But I've been thinking about what to do with it, and I've made a decision. What decision? Mason asked, watching her intently. I want to contribute it to Broken Spur, Margaret said, not as a sale but as an investment, a partnership, if you will. Mason stared at her, clearly taken aback. A partnership? Yes, my land, combined with your knowledge and resources. I'd be a small partner, of course, owning just a fraction of the whole, but it would give me a real stake in the future of this place. She hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Unless you object to having a woman as a business partner, object, Mason repeated, a slow smile spreading across his face. Margaret Hayes, you continue to amaze me. A partnership is. Well, it's a perfect solution, but are you sure it's what you want? I'm sure, she said with quiet conviction. More sure than I've been about anything in a very long time. Their eyes held, and in that moment, something shifted between them, a barrier falling away. Mason reached out, his hand finding hers on the quilt. There's something else I need to tell you, he said, his voice low and serious. Something I've been feeling for some time now. Margaret's heart quickened, but before Mason could continue, a knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Bentley's voice called through the wood. Is everything all right in there? Does Mr. Cole need anything for the pain? The moment broken, Margaret rose quickly from the bed, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. He's settled now, she called back. I'll be right out. She turned back to Mason, who was watching her with an expression of mingled frustration and amusement. We'll continue this conversation when you're feeling better, she promised. For now, you need to rest. Margaret, Mason said as she reached the door, I'm glad you're staying at Broken Spur, gladder than I can say. So am I, she replied softly, and with a last smile she slipped from the room, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The following days were filled with a curious mixture of tension and tenderness as Margaret helped care for Mason during his recovery. His injuries, while painful, were not severe enough to keep him confined to bed for long, but they did necessitate a reduction in his usual activities, much to his frustration. I should be out there with the men, he complained on the third morning, watching from the porch as Jake led the Cowboys out for the day's roundup work. Sitting here like an invalid while they do all the heavy lifting. They're perfectly capable, Margaret reminded him, setting a cup of coffee beside his chair. Jake has everything well in hand. I know, Mason sighed, but it's hard to just sit and watch. Consider it an opportunity to catch up on the account books, Margaret suggested. You're always saying you never have enough time for the paperwork. He made a face that reminded her of a reluctant schoolboy, and she laughed, the sound carrying on the crisp autumn air. Very well, bring me the ledgers. At least it's something useful I can do with one arm. They settled into a comfortable routine, with Margaret bringing her mending to the porch while Mason worked on the ranch accounts. They talked easily as they worked, discussing everything from cattle prices to the latest letter from Mrs. Bentley's sister in Denver. She says there's talk of extending the railroad further into the territory next year, Margaret reported, threading her needle. Imagine being able to reach Denver in a day instead of a week. Progress comes whether we want it or not, Mason observed, making a notation in his ledger. Though I'm not sure I like the idea of trains bringing more people to our quiet corner of the world. You don't want neighbors, Margaret teased. Got all the neighbors I need, he replied with a smile that made her cheeks warm. Though I suppose more settlement means more opportunities for selling beef, so I shouldn't complain. As the days passed, Margaret found herself increasingly aware of Mason's gaze following her when she moved about the house, and of the way her own eyes sought him out whenever she entered a room. There was something growing between them, something neither had yet put into words, but which was becoming more difficult to ignore with each passing day. The conversation they had begun in his bedroom remained unfinished, both seemingly waiting for the right moment to resume it. Margaret sensed that Mason was holding back, perhaps still concerned about the imbalance in their positions, while she was hesitant to speak first, the scars of her marriage to Marshall still tender beneath the surface. It was Mrs. Bentley who finally broke the stalemate, cornering Margaret in the pantry one afternoon about a week after Mason's accident. "This has gone on long enough," the housekeeper declared, hands on her hips. "You two are dancing around each other like skittish colts, and it's driving me to distraction." Margaret busied herself arranging jars of preserved peaches, avoiding the older woman's knowing gaze. "I don't know what you mean. Don't play innocent with me, girl," Mrs. Bentley said, though her tone was affectionate. "I've seen the way you look at him when you think no one's watching. And he's just as bad, mooning over you like a lovesick boy instead of a grown man." Margaret's hands stilled on the jars. "It's complicated, Pshaw," Mrs. Bentley scoffed. "Only because you're both making it so. He loves you. Anyone with eyes can see that. And unless I'm completely misreading the signs, you love him too." "Even if that were true," Margaret said carefully, "there are considerations. My past, for one. I'm still legally married to Marshall for all I know. Desertion is grounds for divorce in this territory, Mrs. Bentley informed her matter-of-factly. "And that man deserted you clear enough, took the money and ran. Judge Parker would grant you a divorce in a heartbeat if you asked. And then there's the matter of my position here," Margaret continued, voicing another concern that had troubled her. "I'm Mason's employee. What would people think if..." "If what?" "If the owner of the biggest ranch in the county married a respectable woman who happens to work for him, they'd think it was about time he settled down, that's what." Mrs. Bentley's expression softened. "Life's too short and too hard out here to let happiness slip away because of what others might think, child." Margaret looked up at the older woman, seeing the wisdom of years and experience in her lined face. "You really think he loves me?" "I know it," Mrs. Bentley said firmly. "But he's a proud man, and he's worried about taking advantage of your situation. He needs to know you feel the same way of your own free will, not out of gratitude or because you feel trapped." "I've never felt trapped here," Margaret said softly. "Only safe and valued." "Then tell him that," Mrs. Bentley advised, patting her hand, "before one or both of you grows old waiting for the perfect moment that never comes." The opportunity presented itself that very evening, after supper with Mrs. Bentley conveniently claiming a headache and retiring early. Margaret and Mason found themselves alone in the parlor. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, soft flakes drifting past the windows and settling on the ground in a thin white blanket. Mason stood at the window, watching the snow, his injured arm still in a sling but healing well. The firelight cast his profile in sharp relief, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the thoughtful set of his mouth. First snow always makes me think of new beginnings, he said without turning from the window. Covering everything, giving the world a fresh start. Margaret moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body but not quite touching. Is that what you want, Mason? A fresh start? Now he did turn to look at her, his blue eyes serious in the dim light. Depends on what I'd be starting and who I'd be starting it with. Her heart beating faster, Margaret took a deep breath and decided to be as direct as the man before her. Earlier, before your accident, you mentioned a business partnership between us. I've been thinking about it and I'd like to formalize that arrangement as soon as possible. A flicker of something disappointment crossed Mason's face before he nodded. Of course. I'll have the papers drawn up when I next go into town. Thank you, Margaret said, and then, gathering her courage, added, but that's not the only partnership I've been considering. Mason went very still, his eyes never leaving her face. Oh, Mrs. Bentley tells me that desertion is grounds for divorce in this territory, Margaret continued, her voice steadier than she felt. That I could petition Judge Parker to end my marriage to Marshall legally. That's true, Mason confirmed carefully, if that's what you want. It is, Margaret said. Not because I harbor any illusions about Marshall returning, I know he won't, but because I want to be free, truly free, to build a new life. A life that includes. She faltered, suddenly uncertain. Includes what, Margaret? Mason prompted softly, moving a step closer. You, she whispered, looking up into his face. If you'll have me. For a long moment, Mason stood perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might shatter the moment. Then, slowly, he raised his good hand to cup her cheek, his touch achingly gentle. Have you? He repeated, his voice rough with emotion. Margaret, I've been falling in love with you since the moment you faced down your husband on that auction platform with more courage than most men I've known. These past months, watching you build a place for yourself here, seeing your strength and kindness. I've been fighting the urge to tell you how I feel because I wanted to be sure you had the freedom to choose your own path. And if my path leads to you, Margaret asked, her heart in her throat. Then I'd be the happiest man in the territory, Mason said simply. But I need to know it's what you truly want, not what you think you ought to want, or what you think I want to hear. Mason Cole, Margaret said, her voice gaining strength with each word, I am choosing you of my own free will and with my whole heart. I love you not because you rescued me, but because of the man you are every day. Kind, honest, hardworking, and decent to your core. The smile that broke across Mason's face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds, transforming his features with joy. I love you, Margaret Hayes. Have for months now, been driving Mrs. Bentley to distraction trying to hide it. Margaret laughed, a sound of pure happiness. She noticed anyway. Told me we were both being ridiculous. Smart woman, Mrs. Bentley, Mason murmured, drawing Margaret closer with his good arm. Always said she had more sense than the rest of us combined. And then he was kissing her, a kiss that held all the tenderness and passion that had been building between them since that first day in Redemption Creek. Margaret melted into him, her arms sliding around his neck as she returned the kiss with equal fervor. All her doubts and fears falling away like the snow outside covering the past and making way for new beginnings. When they finally parted, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said, the words somewhere between a question and a plea. As soon as your divorce is final, be my wife, my partner in everything. Help me build Broken Spur into something we can be proud of together. Yes, Margaret whispered, her heart too full for more elaborate words. Yes to all of it. Later, as they sat before the fire, Margaret nestled against Mason's side. They made plans for their future, practical plans about the ranch and the partnership, but also dreams of the life they would build together. We'll need to expand the house if we're to have a family, Mason mused, his arm around her shoulders. Always thought those rooms on the east side would make a good nursery with the morning sun. A family, Margaret repeated, the word filling her with a warmth she hadn't dared to imagine for herself after the disaster of her marriage to Marshall. I'd like that, very much. How many children would you want? Mason asked, his fingers playing with a strand of her hair. 2 or 3, perhaps, she said, smiling at the thought. Enough to fill the house with laughter, but not so many we can't give each one the attention they deserve. Wise as always, Mason approved, and we'll teach them everything they need to know about the ranch, boys and girls alike. No reason a daughter can't learn to ride and rope as well as any son. Margaret looked up at him, love swelling in her heart for this man who saw the world with such clear, kind eyes. You'll be a wonderful father. And you an extraordinary mother, he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. But first things first, we need to get that divorce finalized and make an honest woman of you. Judge Parker's due back on circuit in 2 weeks, Margaret remembered. Mrs. Bentley mentioned it when she got the letter from her sister. 2 weeks, Mason nodded. I'll ride into town tomorrow and speak with Perkins about drawing up the partnership papers for the ranch. While I'm there, I'll inquire about the divorce proceedings. With Marshall gone for months and clear evidence of desertion, it should be straightforward. The practicalities settled, they fell into comfortable silence, watching the fire and the snow falling beyond the window, each lost in thoughts of the future they would build together. When Margaret finally went up to her room that night, after a lingering goodnight kiss that promised many more to come, she paused at her writing desk and took out the deed to her 50 acres. The document that had represented her first taste of independence would now become the foundation of a true partnership, both in business and in life. Tracing her fingers over the official seal, she smiled at the irony Marshall had tried to sell her for land, but in the end, that very transaction had led her to a love deeper and truer than she'd ever known. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity and anticipation. Mason rode into town as planned and returned with the news that Judge Parker would indeed hear Margaret's petition for divorce when he arrived. Perkins, the land agent who doubled as the town's only lawyer, had drawn up the partnership papers for Broken Spur, officially making Margaret a part owner of the ranch. It's all here, Mason said, spreading the documents on the dining room table for her inspection. 10% ownership initially, based on the value of your 50 acres, with provisions for increasing your share over time as the ranch prospers. Margaret studied the legal language carefully, her father's emphasis on education serving her well. It looks fair and thorough, she agreed, then looked up at Mason with a smile. Though I imagine our marriage will make these ownership percentages somewhat academic. Perhaps, he acknowledged, returning her smile, but I wanted you to have this in your own right, regardless of our personal relationship. You earned it. The day Judge Parker arrived in Redemption Creek, Mason and Margaret rode into town together, accompanied by Jake as a witness to the proceedings. The judge, a stern-faced man with piercing eyes and a reputation for strict but fair rulings, listened to Margaret's account of her marriage to Marshall Winters and his subsequent desertion and sale of her at public auction. In all my years on the bench, I've heard many tales of marital discord, Mrs. Winters, but your husband's actions are among the most reprehensible, the judge pronounced, his bushy eyebrows drawing together in disapproval. The law is clear in cases of desertion, particularly when accompanied by such egregious conduct. Your petition for divorce is granted, effective immediately. With a bang of his gavel, Margaret's marriage was dissolved, the last legal tie to Marshall Winters severed. As they emerged from the makeshift courtroom in the back of the land office, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years, as if a weight she'd grown accustomed to carrying had suddenly been lifted from her shoulders. How does it feel to be Miss Hayes again? Mason asked as they walked toward the hotel where they planned to have lunch before the ride back to Broken Spur. Wonderful, Margaret admitted, then added with a sideways glance, though I don't intend to remain Miss Hayes for long if you're still of the same mind as when you proposed. Mason's smile was answer enough, but he said, more certain than ever. When would you like to have the wedding? They decided on a simple ceremony 2 weeks hence, to be held at Broken Spur with their ranch family in attendance. News of their engagement spread quickly through the small community, and to Margaret's surprise, it was met with widespread approval and even excitement. About time Cole found himself a wife, she overheard one of the older cowboys telling another as they mended a fence near the house. And Miss Hayes is a fine choice, got spirit and sense, that one. The day of the wedding dawned clear and cold, a perfect late November morning with frost sparkling on the grass and a sky so blue it hurt to look at it. Mrs. Bentley had outdone herself preparing the house, with evergreen boughs and late-blooming wildflowers decorating the parlor where the ceremony would take place. Margaret dressed in a gown of deep blue silk that Mason had insisted on ordering from Denver, despite her protests that it was an extravagance. "Nothing's too good for my bride," he declared, and the look in his eyes had silenced any further objections. As she stood before the small mirror in her room, soon to be her former room, as she would move into the master's suite with Mason after the wedding, Margaret hardly recognized the woman who looked back at her. Gone was the fearful, subdued wife Marshall had tried to auction off like cattle. In her place stood a confident, radiant woman on the verge of a new life with a man she loved and who loved her in return. A knock at the door announced Mrs. Bentley, who entered with tears already glistening in her eyes. "Oh, my dear," she said, clasping her hands together. "You look absolutely beautiful. Mason won't know what hit him." "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Bentley," Margaret said, embracing the older woman. "For welcoming me, for guiding me, for seeing what Mason and I couldn't quite see ourselves." "Pish-posh," the housekeeper said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "You two just needed a little nudge in the right direction. Now it's time. Everyone's waiting downstairs, and that man of yours is about to wear a hole in the carpet with his pacing." The ceremony itself was brief but deeply moving. Judge Parker, who had stayed in the area to officiate after hearing their story, spoke eloquently about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of mutual respect and partnership. Margaret and Mason exchanged simple vows they had written themselves, promises to love, honor, and cherish each other through whatever life might bring. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge declared, and a cheer went up from the assembled ranch hands as Mason kissed his bride. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with food and drink flowing freely, music from Jake's fiddle and another cowboy's harmonica, and dancing that left everyone breathless and laughing. As the evening wore on, Mason and Margaret slipped away from the festivities, walking hand in hand under a sky ablaze with stars to the quiet of their home now, truly and completely. "Happy, Mrs. Cole?" Mason asked as they stood on the porch, the sounds of celebration drifting faintly from the bunkhouse where the party continued. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Margaret replied, leaning into the solid warmth of her husband's embrace. "When I think of how close I came to a very different fate." "Don't think of it," Mason said, turning her to face him. "That's the past. This you and me, Broken Spur, our future together, this is what matters now." As he lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that held all the promise of that future, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home and her true love. From the horror of that auction block to the joy of this moment, her journey had been difficult and unexpected, but it had led her exactly where she was meant to be, in the arms of a man who saw her not as property to be sold, but as a partner to be cherished. 2 years later, Margaret stood on the porch of the expanded Broken Spur ranch house, watching as Mason rode in from the south pasture, their 1-year-old son Matthew balanced carefully in front of him on the saddle. The little boy was squealing with delight, his chubby hands clutching the saddle horn while his father's strong arms kept him securely in place. "Look, Mama," Matthew called as they approached. "Riding." "I see you, my brave boy," Margaret called back, smiling at the identical grins on her husband's and son's faces. Mason had been the same with their daughter, Meredith, now 3, taking her for her first ride before she could even walk properly. Broken Spur had prospered beyond their expectations in the years since their marriage. The ranch had expanded, adding another 1,000 acres and doubling their herd. The partnership that had begun with Margaret's 50 acres had grown into a true collaboration, with Margaret handling the business side of the operation while Mason managed the day-to-day ranching activities. As Mason dismounted and lifted Matthew down, setting the toddler on his feet to toddle excitedly toward his mother, Margaret felt a wave of gratitude for the life they had built together. Their family, their home, their work, all of it bound together by a love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances, but had grown stronger with each passing day. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" Mason asked as he joined her on the porch, wrapping an arm around her waist and pressing a kiss to her temple. "About how fortunate I am," Margaret replied, leaning into him while keeping a watchful eye on Matthew, who was now exploring a fascinating beetle crawling across the porch floor. "About how different my life might have been if you hadn't stepped forward that day in Redemption Creek." "I think about that too," Mason admitted. "Sometimes I wake up in the night and just watch you sleeping beside me, amazed that you're really there, that all of this is real." "It's real," Margaret assured him, turning in his arms to face him, "and it's only getting better." She took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach, where the first slight curve was just becoming noticeable. "We're going to need that third bedroom we've been talking about adding to the nursery wing." Mason's eyes widened, then crinkled with joy as her meaning registered. "Another baby, you're sure, Mrs. Bentley confirmed it yesterday," Margaret said, laughing as Mason lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. "She's already planning how to rearrange the nursery to accommodate another little Cole." As Mason set her down and bent to share the news with Matthew, who was far more interested in his beetle than in the prospect of another sibling, Margaret's thoughts turned again to the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. Marshall Winters had tried to auction her for land, seeing her as nothing more than property to be traded. But Mason Cole had seen her true worth, offering land for her freedom and then his heart for her love. In the end, what had begun as a desperate act of cruelty had led to a life filled with more joy, purpose, and love than Margaret could ever have imagined possible. And as she watched her husband and son now chasing the beetle across the porch, their laughter ringing in the clear mountain air, she knew with absolute certainty that this family, this home, this love was exactly where she was meant to be.